Between 1822 and 1824, something horrifying unfolded on a rice plantation near Georgetown, South Carolina, an event so disturbing that even the most hardened overseers refused to return to work there. 17 documented incidents, 43 unexplained injuries, and the deliberate erasure of one enslaved man's name from all plantation records marked this dark chapter. Yet his story lived on in whispers that traveled through the slave quarters of 3 counties for decades. The only written trace was a haunting journal entry by a local magistrate in 1824, later discovered in 1963, reading, "We have created something we cannot control. God forgive us for what we did to make him this way." This entry became the only surviving acknowledgement of a man whose very existence terrified those who sought to erase him. What could turn one man into something so feared, so powerful, that his enslavers would try to delete his name from history? The answer, buried within Georgetown's plantation records, reveals the true cost of cruelty and the terrifying strength of resistance born from unbearable pain. The story begins not with violence, but with what seemed at first an ordinary arrival in 1819, ordinary, at least, by the brutal standards of that time. Georgetown, a small town resting along the Waccamaw River, thrived on 2 things, rice and human suffering. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of pluff mud, while the sounds of enslaved workers' songs drifted across the swamps. Fair Haven Plantation, owned by Marcus Hewitt, stood on 200 acres of prime rice land. About 300 enslaved people toiled there, their worth measured not in humanity but in bushels of rice harvested. Hewitt was known among other planters for 2 things: his unmatched profits and his unmatched cruelty. Rumors spread that his methods were excessive, that his punishments crossed even the cruel standards of the day, but no one could argue with his wealth, over 80,000 barrels of rice a year, each one soaked in the invisible blood and tears of his workers. The overseer, Silas Drummond, was a veteran of 23 years on the plantation, a man hardened by violence and prideful of his reputation for discipline. He had long convinced himself that his cruelty was efficiency, that breaking spirits without breaking bodies was an art. To him, people were instruments of profit, and he claimed he could judge a person's character within a week. But when a chained group of 17 newly purchased slaves arrived from Charleston one May morning, Drummond's instincts failed him. Among the group stood a man known only as Samuel, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused by ironwork. Records listed him as 26, a trained blacksmith sold from the estate of Thomas Radcliffe after a bankruptcy. What those records concealed, however, was that Samuel had been sold 5 times in 7 years, each sale following mysterious incidents that were never explained. His calm demeanor and quiet gaze concealed something deeper, something that those around him mistook for obedience but was, in truth, resolve. Beside Samuel stood his wife, Clara, 4 months pregnant, her hand locked in his despite orders not to touch. Their 2 children had been sold separately in Charleston, sent inland to other plantations. Samuel had watched their sale without expression, but inside something had hardened, his grief cooling into iron. Fair Haven's slave quarters were 40 pine cabins arranged in perfect rows behind the main house, each holding 6 to 8 people. The walls were thin, letting in both the coastal cold and the summer mosquitoes. Samuel and Clara were assigned to cabin 14, shared with other couples and 2 children. Life there was ruled by the task system, a deceptive form of control that required each enslaved person to finish a daily quota of backbreaking labor. In theory, completing one's task earned rest. In reality, tasks were calibrated to push bodies to exhaustion. Samuel began in the rice fields like the rest, ankle deep in muddy water under the burning sun, surrounded by snakes and insects. Despite his valuable skill as a blacksmith, Hewitt kept him in the fields, just another laboring body. But Samuel watched and learned. He observed Drummond's routes, noted which workers held influence, which ones carried messages, and how punishments were dealt. Every lash, every command, every whisper became data, stored in the silence behind his calm face. He understood quickly that survival required patience, and that resistance required knowledge. Clara, meanwhile, weakened as her pregnancy advanced, her body worn down by heat and hunger. When she finally collapsed under the weight of her burden, Drummond coldly ordered Samuel to finish both their tasks or face the whip. It was at that moment that Samuel spoke the word that would change everything: no. That refusal, spoken calmly under the Carolina sun, marked the first fracture in the illusion of absolute control at Fair Haven. It was the spark that would, in time, set the entire plantation ablaze, literally and symbolically, and begin the story of the man history tried to erase. Under the blistering sun of South Carolina, Samuel's refusal rippled through Fair Haven like a forbidden prayer, a sound no one dared make, but everyone longed to hear. For a long moment after he said no, silence held the air still, heavy with the weight of something unthinkable, a man in chains defying an overseer. Drummond's face turned crimson, his whip poised in disbelief, yet the stillness in Samuel's stance unsettled him. It wasn't arrogance or madness, it was control. "You'll tend to my wife properly," Samuel said, his tone even, calm, dangerous. "You'll call for the doctor, make sure she and the child survive, and I'll finish both our tasks." It was the way he said it that shook Drummond most, not pleading, not bargaining, but demanding like an equal. The overseer sputtered, torn between rage and confusion, because men like Samuel weren't supposed to exist in this world. Still, the logic of profit outweighed anger. Samuel wasn't just a man. He was property worth hundreds of dollars, and Hewitt would not forgive damage to his investment. So Drummond spat into the dirt and agreed, declaring Samuel would do double work for a week. When Samuel lifted Clara gently from the mud and carried her toward the sick house, others watched in awe. They had seen men beaten for less, but this one had faced his master's whip and walked away unbroken. The whispers began that night, quiet ones, dangerous ones, of a man who had said no and lived. The doctor arrived later that day, a young man named Patterson, who examined Clara briefly and declared she must rest a full week, her pregnancy in danger. For once, medicine and morality aligned with Samuel's demand, though the mercy was laced with bitterness. Hewitt allowed the rest, but ordered Samuel to complete double tasks each day to make up for her absence. What followed became legend among the enslaved, an act of endurance so profound that it defied the limits of flesh. From dawn until night, Samuel labored in the rice fields, finishing his own quota before beginning Clara's. The heat shimmered off the flooded fields, insects biting at his sweat, slicked skin, but still he worked, every motion a rebellion. By the third day, others began helping him quietly. An extra row planted here, a weed pulled there. No words were exchanged, no signals given, yet the community moved as one, each small act of aid invisible but vital. Together, they turned survival into solidarity. Drummond noticed. He saw the subtle cooperation, the rhythm of people refusing isolation, and it terrified him more than any weapon could. That night, he came to Samuel's cabin with 3 other overseers, torches blazing. He ordered Samuel outside, demanding to know who had helped him. Samuel met his gaze without fear and said, "Every evening you inspected both tasks and found them done. Whatever help I received was freely given after work was finished." It was an answer no whip could refute. But Drummond didn't want truth. He wanted submission. He told Samuel to strip, his voice low and venomous. In the flickering torchlight, the scars on Samuel's back glistened like maps of past suffering. "This isn't about work," Drummond said for all to hear. "It's about remembering your place." The first lash fell, sharp and deliberate, splitting skin, then another and another. Samuel did not scream. The silence between each strike grew heavier, more defiant. By the 10th blow, Drummond's arm trembled from effort, but Samuel stood tall, fists clenched, head unbowed. "Kneel," Drummond shouted. "Kneel, or I'll tear the skin from your bones." Samuel's answer came steady and cold. "You can beat me until I can't stand, but I won't kneel, not for you, not for any man who thinks he owns me." The crowd gasped, a collective breath caught between fear and awe. Before Drummond could strike again, another voice broke through the night. Marcus Hewitt had arrived, drawn by the commotion. He studied the scene with cold curiosity, like a man examining a strange animal. "That's enough," he said quietly. Then, turning to Samuel, he spoke almost kindly. "You're remarkable. Pride like yours either gets beaten out or burns you up. We'll see which happens." Samuel met his gaze. "Time will tell," he replied. Hewitt smiled thinly and ordered the punishment to stop. Samuel had earned a dangerous kind of respect, but also the scrutiny of a man who saw intelligence and will as threats. "I'll be watching you," Hewitt warned. "You don't want my attention." That night, Clara lay weak but alive in the sick house, and Samuel's body burned with pain. Yet when he held her hand, she whispered, "You made them afraid." He said nothing, but the truth hung between them. They both knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. 6 weeks later, Clara gave birth to a daughter, Ruth. For a brief moment, hope returned to their small cabin. Samuel's rough hands cradled the infant with infinite gentleness, and Clara sang the same lullabies she had once sung to the children taken from them. But at Fairhaven, joy was never safe. That November, the plantation's blacksmith Joseph died suddenly of fever. With no one to maintain the tools, Hewitt turned to Samuel, the man he both feared and needed. Samuel was pulled from the fields and placed in the forge, a small mercy, but also a cage of iron and watchful eyes. The forge stood just 50 yards from Hewitt's study window, close enough for constant observation. To others, it seemed an improvement, protection from the field's misery, but Samuel saw the truth. Hewitt wanted control, not kindness. Still, in the rhythm of hammer and flame, Samuel found something that felt like freedom. Each strike of the anvil was a heartbeat, each spark a fleeting reminder that creation could exist even in bondage. And though he worked under the master's gaze, he also worked for himself in secret, shaping small pieces of metal, hidden tools that no one else knew about. Every file, wedge, and sliver of iron he forged was not just craft. It was preparation for something coming, something inevitable, something born the moment he said no. The cold months settled over Fairhaven, bringing with them a deceptive calm that hid the quiet tension growing beneath the surface. December arrived, and with it, a false gesture of generosity. As was customary among slaveholders, Marcus Hewitt announced that Christmas would bring 3 days of rest, extra food, and a small ration of liquor. It was a performance of benevolence, meant to remind the enslaved that mercy existed only through the master's will. Samuel understood the cruelty behind this illusion, freedom offered as a gift, then taken back before it could be believed. On Christmas Eve, Hewitt summoned him to the main house. The news spread through the quarters like smoke. Being called to the house at night never meant anything good. Clara stood in their doorway, clutching Ruth to her chest, her eyes filled with dread as she watched him walk across the yard, his figure framed by torchlight. Inside, Hewitt sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, surrounded by ledgers that recorded human lives as lines of profit and loss. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Samuel obeyed. The silence stretched until it felt like a weight pressing against his chest. Then Hewitt looked up, his pale eyes cold with curiosity rather than anger. "You know why you're here?" Samuel shook his head. "I wanted a conversation," Hewitt said, "between two intelligent men." The words startled Samuel. It wasn't that Hewitt saw him as an equal. He didn't, but he recognized something unusual, something dangerous. "You're educated," Hewitt continued. "I can see it in how you speak, how you think. Someone taught you to read once, didn't they?" Samuel said nothing. Literacy was forbidden, punishable by mutilation or death. But Hewitt only smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I'm not interested in turning you in. I'm interested in understanding you. He stood and began pacing slowly. I've seen all kinds of slaves, he said. The ones born broken, the ones broken by life, the ones who resist and die for it. And then there are the rare few who never break. That's you. You should have been crushed years ago, but somehow you're still whole. So I wonder, what would it take to make you accept your place? Samuel's mind raced. It was a trap, though not a simple one. He spoke carefully, each word chosen like a blacksmith choosing his strike. You're asking the wrong question, sir, he said quietly. You can't make me accept slavery because that would mean believing I deserve it, and I know I don't. You can force me to work, but you can't make me believe it's right. Hewitt's lips curled into a smile, cold, thin, unsettling. That's the answer I expected, he said. And it confirms my fears. You see too clearly, Samuel. You're dangerous because you understand. He turned back toward the window, watching the flicker of lamplight over his fields. Men like you are why we have patrols and chains, but danger can be useful if directed properly. I have a proposition. You'll remain my blacksmith and train others in the trade. In return, I'll ensure Clara's work stays light and your family stays together. As long as you obey, I won't sell any of you. The offer hit Samuel like a hammer. It was not mercy, it was manipulation. Hewitt knew exactly what string to pull. Keeping his family together was the only thing that mattered to him. If he refused, Clara and Ruth would be sold away, lost forever. If he accepted, he'd be trading his defiance for a fragile safety built on Hewitt's whim. And if I refuse? Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. Hewitt's smile sharpened. Then I'll sell them south before sunrise and keep you here alone. You'd learn obedience soon enough. The words landed like a death sentence disguised as choice. Samuel stood silent for a long time before finally saying, I accept your terms. Hewitt nodded, writing a note in his ledger as if sealing a business deal. Good. Remember, this isn't friendship, it's efficiency. You're still property. That night, Samuel returned to the cabin with the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. He told Clara everything, the promise, the threat, the bargain. She wept quietly while he held her, and they both understood what the deal truly meant. They had been given slightly longer chains, nothing more. Yet in that darkness, even a longer chain could mean survival. The new year began colder than anyone remembered. Frost glazed the flooded rice fields, and the workers shivered in rags too thin to protect them from the biting air. Samuel spent his days in the forge, training 3 men in the craft. He taught them patiently, explaining fire control, metal strength, and shaping techniques. To them, learning the trade was hope itself, a way out of the fields, out of back-breaking labor. But Samuel's mind was elsewhere, always working behind his silence. The deal he had accepted gnawed at him. Hewitt's promises could vanish with a whim or a debt. If Hewitt died, his family would be sold like tools in an estate sale. Even safety was just another lie in a system built on lies. So Samuel began to notice things no one else paid attention to: the paths patrol riders took at night, when supply wagons arrived and left, which roads led toward Georgetown and which led into the swamps. He memorized the geography of escape, not because he had a plan yet, but because he knew someday he would need one. His mind had become a map of possibilities. In February, a man arrived at Fair Haven who would destroy the fragile peace Samuel had built. His name was William Sterling, a slave trader traveling north to Virginia. He came to buy 3 people Hewitt considered troublesome, and out of curiosity stopped to inspect the forge. Samuel was working when the trader approached, the rhythmic clanging of iron echoing through the air. Sterling watched him for a few minutes, then said, "You do fine work. Where'd you learn?" "Virginia," Samuel replied, not looking up. "Fredericksburg." At that, the trader's expression changed. "Fredericksburg? What was your master's name?" Samuel hesitated. "Don't recall, sir," he lied, but Sterling's smile widened. "I do. Thomas Radcliffe. You're the blacksmith who was there when his boy died in that stable fire." The words hit Samuel like a blow. His mind flashed back to the night 8 years before, the young Radcliffe boy, drunk and violent, attacking him in the forge, the struggle, the lantern falling, the fire consuming the stable before anyone could act. The boy had died screaming, and Samuel had been sold days later to bury the scandal. Sterling's eyes gleamed with malice. "I remember that story," he said softly, "and I think Mr. Hewitt would be very interested in hearing it." It wasn't curiosity, it was blackmail. Samuel said nothing, his heart pounding as Sterling turned away, already calculating how to profit from what he knew. That night, Samuel lay awake listening to the forge's embers crackle outside. He realized that his past, the one thing he couldn't escape, had found him again, and the life he'd built for Clara and Ruth hung by a thread. The next morning, Hewitt sent for him, confirming his fears. Sterling had told him everything and offered to buy Samuel back for a high price. Hewitt declined for now. "You're too valuable here," he said coldly, "but cause me one more problem, and I'll sell you north to face the law." Samuel bowed his head, outwardly obedient, inwardly breaking apart. The ghost of the fire he thought was long buried had returned, and this time it would burn everything. For 3 days after Sterling's threat, Samuel lived with the uneasy feeling that every sound in the night carried danger. He worked at the forge, silent and focused, but his mind churned. He knew Sterling was waiting, certain that Hewitt's greed or fear would eventually make him sell. Each swing of Samuel's hammer became a heartbeat of defiance, each spark a flicker of resistance he dared not show. When Sterling finally left Georgetown, the air seemed to loosen for a moment, yet what he left behind was worse than fear. It was fury. That night, a domestic servant named Rachel returned from the town tavern where she had worked during a gathering of plantation owners. She pulled Samuel aside, her face pale and voice trembling. "Sterling was there," she whispered. "He was drinking, boasting about the people he's broken." The words spilled out like poison. Sterling had told the other planters about his methods of controlling the enslaved, torture, starvation, psychological torment. And then, laughing, he told a story about a woman from Charleston with 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. He described how he had separated them, selling the children to buyers in Georgia and sending the mother to Cuba, laughing as he mimicked her screams. Rachel's voice broke when she said he called it entertainment. The details, the ages, the timing, matched perfectly. Samuel understood with sickening clarity. Sterling had been the one who tore his children from Clara's arms. For a long time, Samuel didn't move. The forge fire burned low, throwing dull red light across his face as the truth sank in. All the years of restraint, all the patience he had forced himself to hold, it shattered. The rage that filled him wasn't wild but cold and deliberate, like metal hardening after heat. He began to work. Through the night, the rhythmic strike of his hammer echoed across Fair Haven, a slow, steady sound that no one dared interrupt. By dawn, he had forged 3 small iron keys. Each fit a specific lock he had quietly studied for months: the storage shed, the tack room, and the smokehouse near the edge of the property. They were perfectly made, slender enough to hide inside his sleeve. To anyone else, it looked like just another night's labor, but to Samuel, it was preparation. He didn't know yet what form his next act would take, but he knew this: he would never again let others decide his fate. In the following weeks, life on the plantation seemed normal, but a quiet unease hung in the air. Drummond's favorite riding crop disappeared one night, and though he searched every cabin, it was never found. A week later, Hewitt's prized hunting dog died mysteriously, the veterinarian whispering about oleander poisoning but finding no proof. 2 weeks after that, Drummond fell violently ill with cramps and fever, confined to bed for 3 days. To outsiders, these were coincidences. To Hewitt, they felt like warnings. He tightened security, ordered earlier curfews, and stalked the plantation with suspicion burning in his eyes. But no one could point to Samuel. He worked the forge as always, speaking little, his expression calm, his movements deliberate. Only Clara noticed the change, the way his eyes lingered on the fire too long, the way he sometimes sat awake in the darkness, his face illuminated by dying embers, as if speaking silently to something unseen. In May, a traveling preacher arrived at Fairhaven, a Methodist minister named Rev. Thompson, who preached to both enslaved and white congregations. Hewitt believed religion made the enslaved more obedient, and he welcomed the preacher's visits. Thompson's sermon that Sunday was from the book of Exodus, the story of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt and freed by divine intervention. He spoke carefully, emphasizing patience, obedience, and endurance, softening every dangerous implication. But stories of freedom have their own power, no matter how they're told. As the preacher spoke of plagues, of blood and death, of God's vengeance upon Pharaoh, Samuel's expression darkened with intensity. When Thompson reached the part where Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea, Samuel's fists clenched at his sides. After the sermon, while others lingered to pray, Samuel approached the preacher quietly. "Reverend," he asked, "was Moses right to kill the Egyptian before God called him to lead the people?" The question startled Thompson. "That was not God's command," he said hesitantly. "Moses acted in anger and fled." Samuel's voice was low but steady. "He saw injustice and acted. He didn't wait for permission." Thompson frowned. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to man. Our suffering in this world will be repaid in the next." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "And if waiting for the next life means accepting injustice in this one, what then?" The preacher had no answer. He muttered something about faith and walked away, shaken. Later that day, he mentioned the conversation to Hewitt, warning that Samuel seemed troubled, his questions too bold. Hewitt nodded, making a note in his ledger. Samuel was thinking dangerous thoughts again. The breaking point came in June. Clara, who had spent months performing lighter duties since Ruth's birth, was suddenly reassigned to full fieldwork. The old overseer, Drummond, had fallen ill too often, so Hewitt hired a new man named Jacob Cross, young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. Cross viewed mercy as weakness and saw Clara's lighter workload as favoritism. When Samuel learned what had happened, he went straight to Hewitt's study. "Sir, you promised she'd have lighter duties while nursing," he said. "Sending her to the fields breaks that promise." Hewitt didn't even look up from his papers. "That arrangement was made when you were my only blacksmith. You've trained others now. Things change." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Then you're breaking your word?" Hewitt's gaze snapped upward, his voice turning cold. "Careful, Samuel. If you have a problem, we can revisit Sterling's offer." The old threat hung heavy in the air, but this time Samuel didn't lower his head. "Then revisit it," he said. The words hung between them like drawn steel. For a heartbeat, the two men stared at each other, the master and the slave, the oppressor and the man who no longer recognized fear. Then Hewitt's voice dropped to a hiss. "Get out of my house, and know you've just sealed your family's fate." That night, Samuel didn't go back to cabin 14. He went to the forge, the only place that ever felt remotely his. The firelight glowed against his scarred back as he worked, hammering not for Hewitt's plantation but for himself. When Clara found him near midnight, Ruth asleep against her chest, she saw the wild look in his eyes. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm making a choice," he said. "For years, I bent and waited. I believed if I just obeyed, we could survive, but there's no safety in obedience. They will kill us slowly if we submit, or quickly if we resist. I'm done bending." He showed her a small cloth bundle he had hidden, a knife, rope, a tinderbox, and the keys he'd forged months before. "If anything happens to me, take Ruth and go north," he said. "Use the keys to get supplies. There's a canoe hidden by the marsh. Follow the river and the stars. Someone will help you." Clara shook her head, terrified. "You're talking about running. They'll kill you." Samuel looked at her with calm resolve. "Maybe, but if I die, I'll die standing, not kneeling." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed outside. Cross had returned, drunk and armed with two men carrying rifles. "Look what we got here," he sneered. "The troublemaker." He stepped forward, ready to drag Samuel out to the stocks. But Samuel moved first. In one swift motion, He twisted Cross's wrist until bone cracked, then struck him in the throat. The overseer fell back choking while the other two men raised their rifles. Samuel ducked behind the anvil, the forge fire casting monstrous shadows across the room. "You can shoot me," he said quietly, "but you'll answer to Hewitt for destroying his blacksmith." The men hesitated. Cross, clutching his throat, spat out, "You just signed your death warrant." "Then make sure you kill me," Samuel said, "because if I live till morning, you'll regret leaving me alive." When they finally retreated into the dark, Clara's hands shook. "What have you done?" she whispered. "They'll hang you, they'll hang all of us." Samuel looked at her, his voice low and steady. "They were always going to. At least now I chose when to stop being afraid." Outside, the night filled with shouts as Cross raised the alarm. Samuel pressed the keys into Clara's hands one last time. "Go," he said. She hesitated, tears streaming down her face, then turned and vanished into the darkness. Samuel turned back to the forge, feeding the flames until they roared. If they came to kill him, he would meet them not as property, but as a man who stood. The night erupted into chaos as the alarm spread across Fair Haven. Torches flared, dogs barked, and voices shouted orders into the humid dark. Samuel stood in the forge, the fire blazing behind him, his body outlined in orange light like a figure forged from flame itself. He knew what was coming. Hewitt's men, armed and furious, driven not just by fear but by the unspoken horror of what he represented. An enslaved man who refused to kneel. He could hear the pounding of boots in the distance, the angry rhythm of vengeance gathering strength. But Samuel no longer felt fear. Something colder and steadier had taken its place. He was done surviving on his knees. As the first glow of torches appeared down the path, he took the long iron rod he had been heating, the metal glowing red, hot at the tip, and gripped it like a weapon. The mob came quickly. 15 men, their faces twisted with righteous fury, their rage sharpened by alcohol and terror. They surrounded the forge, shouting for him to come out, promising death and punishment in the same breath. Marcus Hewitt himself stood among them, dressed in a nightcoat, his expression grim but composed, pretending this was justice and not revenge. "Samuel," Hewitt called out, "come out now and submit. This can end peacefully." Samuel laughed, a sound raw and bitter, echoing from inside the forge. "Peace? You mean my peaceful hanging, my peaceful murder while you call it law?" The crowd murmured angrily at his defiance. "You attacked an overseer," Hewitt shouted back. "You know the penalty." Samuel stepped into the doorway, the heat of the fire roaring behind him, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Your law," he said evenly. "Your justice. The same law that says you can own people, tear families apart, and never answer for it. I'm done pretending it's anything but evil." Hewitt's expression hardened. "Then you've chosen death." He nodded toward the men holding torches. "Burn him out." The command was simple, and within seconds the air filled with the hiss of fire catching dry wood. Torches arced through the night sky, landing on the roof of the forge. Flames licked upward greedily, smoke billowing, heat swelling in suffocating waves. Inside, Samuel had only minutes before the fire consumed everything. He could have stayed and died quietly in the flames, but he chose otherwise. If they wanted a monster to fear, he would give them one. He seized the red, hot iron rod and charged out through the doorway into the ring of men. For an instant the mob froze, stunned by the sight of him bursting from the fire like something born of it. Then he swung. The glowing iron met flesh with a hiss. A man screamed as his sleeve ignited. Another stumbled back, clutching his face. Panic spread through the group as Samuel fought his way through them, each movement filled with purpose and fury. He broke through the line and ran toward the rice fields, drawing them away from the cabins where Clara might be hiding. Behind him, rifles cracked and muzzle flashes tore the dark. The bullets tore through the night air, but Samuel moved fast, his body fueled by pure will. He knew every inch of Fair Haven, the ditches, the marsh paths, the soft ground where a footstep could vanish. The chase stretched for hours. The men cursed as they stumbled through the swamps, their torches flickering in the mist, while dogs bayed in the distance. Samuel led them deep into the marshlands, where the ground grew treacherous and the air stank of stagnant water and death. One man fell into a ditch and broke his leg. Another was bitten by a snake and had to be carried back. Still Samuel ran, his breath ragged but his spirit blazing, refusing to give them the satisfaction of capture. When dawn began to bleed into the sky, he reached a grove of cypress trees at the edge of the plantation. His body was failing, bleeding, exhausted, but he refused to kneel, even to the inevitable. He turned, iron rod still in hand, and waited. When the men finally caught up, they found him standing there, back to a great tree, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with defiance. "Shoot him," someone yelled, but Hewitt, who had followed the chase, raised a hand. "No," he said, his voice icy. "He destroyed property, injured men, and defied his master. He doesn't deserve a clean death. He'll serve as an example." The mob dragged Samuel back to Georgetown, a captive but unbroken. Even bound, his posture was upright, his silence unnerving. The townspeople gathered in the square as word spread. A slave had rebelled, attacked whites, and survived the night. Hewitt wanted a spectacle. He wanted to erase Samuel's defiance with terror. In the center of the square stood a wooden post. They tied Samuel to it while the crowd jeered. The sentence was clear: whipping until death. It would be slow, public, and humiliating, a warning to every enslaved person within miles. But before the punishment began, a disturbance rippled through the crowd. Clara appeared at the edge of the square, Ruth in her arms, flanked by two men from the quarters. She had not run as Samuel told her to. She had hidden all night and now came forward, her eyes dry, her back straight. "I want to see him," she said, her voice carrying through the murmurs. "I have the right to say goodbye to my husband." The crowd fell silent. Hewitt hesitated, perhaps savoring the appearance of magnanimity, then nodded. "Let her through." Clara walked to where Samuel was bound. Their eyes met, and in that look passed everything: love, grief, and the kind of understanding that no words could capture. She touched his face gently, ignoring the blood and dirt. "You are the bravest man I have ever known," she said clearly, her voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. "You never broke. You never accepted their lies. Our daughter will know your name. She will know that her father died standing." Then she leaned forward and kissed him, slow, defiant, full of love in front of everyone. The crowd gasped. That kiss, so simple, so human, was a rebellion greater than any weapon. It was a declaration that no whip, no law, no master could erase the bond between them or the humanity they shared. When she stepped back, Samuel looked out over the sea of faces twisted in hate and fear. "You think you're punishing one man," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the square, "but you're creating something you can't kill, a story that will outlive you. You'll make me into a memory that will haunt you. You can destroy my body, but not what I stand for." First lash fell, splitting the morning air. The crowd watched as the punishment continued, brutal and endless, meant to break not just his body but his defiance. Yet Samuel never screamed. He endured in silence, his gaze fixed beyond the crowd, beyond the world they had built. When he finally died, the sun stood high in the sky, and even Hewitt looked away. They left his body hanging there for 2 days as a warning. 3 days later, Clara and Ruth were sold south to Georgia, but she carried his name and his story with her. She told her daughter about the man who stood, about the night he refused to kneel, and the courage that burned brighter than any fire. Years later, after emancipation, Ruth passed the story on to her own children, and it spread through generations. Plantation records show missing pages from 1820, an erasure of one man's existence, but memory proved stronger than the paper that tried to silence it. In the years that followed, people spoke of him not by name but as the man who stood, a spirit of resistance that could not be owned or destroyed. And long after Fair Haven fell to ruin, his story lived, an unending echo of defiance born from fire, love, and the will to stand unbroken. Years passed, but the legend of Samuel, the man who stood, did not fade. It spread quietly, carried in whispers across plantations, in songs sung low at night, in stories told around fires when the overseers were gone. Even among those who had never seen Fair Haven, his name, or rather, the refusal to speak it, became a symbol of something larger. Enslaved people called him the one who would not kneel, a man who faced death and met it standing. For the enslavers, his memory was a wound that refused to heal. Marcus Hewitt, once proud and composed, began to change. The powerful rice baron who had once ruled his land with cold efficiency grew restless, paranoid, haunted by the ghost of the man he had tried to erase. He stopped sleeping easily, kept weapons by his bed, and often woke screaming from dreams of fire and defiance. He ordered the forge at Fair Haven destroyed, its ashes buried, claiming it was cursed ground. The blackened bricks were left to sink into the soil, and no one dared rebuild it. The place where Samuel had made his last stand became an unspoken boundary, a space everyone avoided, as if the air itself remembered what had happened there. In the years following Samuel's death, strange misfortunes plagued the plantation. A fever swept through the fields one summer, killing more than a dozen workers. A storm destroyed half the rice crop the next season. One of Hewitt's overseers drowned in the marsh under mysterious circumstances, his body found tangled in reeds near the cypress grove where Samuel had made his stand. People began to whisper that Fair Haven was cursed, that the land itself had turned against its master. The enslaved avoided speaking Samuel's name aloud, but they felt his presence everywhere. In the restless wind, in the groaning of the cypress trees, in the forge that would not stay silent even in ruin. Children born on the plantation were told never to go near it, and those who disobeyed swore they heard the faint ringing of a hammer deep underground, echoing like a heartbeat through the earth. For Hewitt, each year became heavier. He drank more, trusting no one. Some nights, he would sit on the veranda staring out at the fields, muttering to himself. Once, a visitor from Georgetown found him sitting in the dark, clutching a pistol, insisting he had seen a figure of fire walking the fields. When asked what he meant, Hewitt only said, "The blacksmith, the one I couldn't break." He dismissed his servants the next morning and rode into town to speak to the magistrate, demanding the court record Samuel's rebellion officially, that his name be condemned and forgotten. But when the clerk went to record the entry, Hewitt stopped him halfway. "Erase it," he said instead. "Erase everything." Days later, several pages disappeared from the plantation's ledgers, torn neatly from the book, the ink stains smudged as if by trembling hands. From that day on, it was as if Samuel had never existed. No purchase record, no death, no mention in accounts or journals. But erasure did not bring peace. It only deepened Hewitt's madness. By 1831, Hewitt was a man unrecognizable from the one who had once commanded hundreds. He roamed the plantation at night with a lantern, muttering prayers, his clothes soaked in sweat. The few remaining overseers said he spoke to someone who wasn't there, pausing often as though listening for a reply. One stormy night, his servants awoke to the sound of a gunshot. They found him dead in his study, his pistol fallen to the floor, his eyes wide open, staring toward the window that faced the old forge. The official record said self-inflicted wound during illness, but among the people of Georgetown another version took hold, that the ghost of the man who stood had come to claim him. After Hewitt's death, Fair Haven changed hands several times. None of its new owners stayed long. Crops failed, structures rotted faster than they should, and strange accidents continued. Workers whispered that the land had memory, that it could not be washed clean. By the time the Civil War ended, Fair Haven was a ruin, its fields overgrown, its cabins falling apart, the main house a shell inhabited by rats and silence. When emancipation came, many of the formerly enslaved refused to return even to collect what little they had left. They said freedom had no meaning in a place where the ground still held chains. Decades later, in 1867, a letter surfaced in Georgetown's local archives. It was written by an elderly woman named Ruth, Samuel and Clara's daughter, now free and living in Savannah. In her careful handwriting, she described the stories her mother had told her. "We called him the man who stood." She wrote, "For they would not let us speak his name. They said it brought trouble, but we knew his name in our hearts. Mama said he died with fire in his hands and truth in his mouth, and because of that, we were never slaves in spirit again. She went on to describe how, as a child, she had dreams of her father standing in fields of fire, his eyes bright as iron, his hands reaching not for vengeance but for light. He never left us, she wrote. He became the voice that said no inside us, and when freedom came, it was his voice we heard first. That letter became one of the few surviving records connecting the legend to a real man. Historians who read it in later years dismissed much of it as superstition, calling it oral tradition exaggerated by time. Yet others recognize something deeper, the truth of how memory survives even when history refuses to. Ruth's letter was found among a box of church records decades later, its paper yellowed but the ink still clear. It ended with a single line that seemed to echo across generations. "We are free because one man remembered he was never born to bow." Over the following decades, the ruins of Fair Haven drew the curious and the fearful alike. Locals claimed that on summer nights, the sound of hammering still rose faintly from the swamp, slow and rhythmic, as though a blacksmith still worked his forge beneath the earth. Some said the air around the site shimmered with heat even in winter. Others that the cypress grove glowed faintly when lightning passed through the clouds. No one stayed long enough to find out. The land remained untouched, haunted not by a ghost but by an idea. The man who stood was no longer a person, but a presence, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, defiance could burn brighter than fire itself. And so, the name erased from the books became a story that outlasted its author. What began as one man's rebellion became a myth of endurance, passed from lips to ears across the South until it was no longer just Samuel's story, but a symbol for every enslaved soul who refused to kneel. The overseers who had once feared him turned to dust, the plantation rotted into soil, but the whisper remained, soft, unending, unkillable, the man who stood. Years rolled onward, and with them the tides of history reshaped everything Samuel had known. The Civil War tore through the South, burning its old order to ash. Georgetown's plantations, once symbols of wealth built on cruelty, lay in ruin. The Waccamaw River still flowed past Fair Haven, but the fields that had once shimmered with rice now drowned in wild grass and silence. Nature reclaimed what had been stolen. Cypress roots pushed through rotted wood, vines strangled the walls of the overseer's quarters. The main house stood hollow, its great veranda sagging, its windows shattered by storms and time. Yet even in ruin, people avoided it. Locals swore that Fair Haven was different from other abandoned estates. The air was heavy there, as though the land itself remembered suffering. Travelers who passed near it claimed they heard faint cries carried on the wind, or the metallic clang of a hammer where no forge had stood for half a century. After emancipation, many freed families moved north or inland, chasing new beginnings. But some stayed near Georgetown, building small settlements in the woods and on the edges of the old plantations. Among them were those who had once lived under Hewitt's rule, men and women who still remembered Samuel's defiance like a sacred secret. On nights when the moon was full, they would gather outside a modest cabin used as a meeting house and tell their children the story of the man who stood. They spoke not with fear but with pride. In their version, Samuel's death was not a tragedy but a transformation. The moment a man became something eternal. They told how the fire that consumed the forge did not destroy him but freed him. They said his spirit walked the fields, watching over those who dared to hope, whispering courage into their dreams. For these people, Samuel had become more than memory. He was resistance itself made flesh and fire. By the late 1800s, his story began to move beyond the local community. Freedmen who had traveled north for work carried it with them to Charleston, to Savannah, even to Richmond. Among the black churches and freedmen's schools that rose after the war, his tale became part of a growing oral tradition about defiance and dignity. Preachers spoke of him in sermons about faith under oppression, comparing his final stand to Moses before Pharaoh or Daniel in the lion's den. For those who had endured centuries of bondage, Samuel's refusal to kneel was more than bravery. It was prophecy. His name was never written in any Bible, but his story was preached like scripture. At the same time, white planters and local officials tried to erase him from the region's history. County records made no mention of any rebellion at Fairhaven. Plantation ledgers from the Hewitt estate remained missing, torn, and incomplete. A few older residents who remembered the story told outsiders that a dangerous slave had gone mad and burned himself alive, an explanation that made the powerful feel safer. But lies rot faster than truth. By the early 20th century, the story of Samuel had taken root across the South in 1,000 variations. Some said he'd escaped into the swamps and lived for years as a ghostly outlaw. Others claimed he was never captured at all, that the man tied to the post was a decoy. In every version, one thing remained constant: he refused to bow. In 1923, a northern historian named Alice Whitmore traveled through Georgetown County collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved families. She recorded several accounts of the man who stood. In her notes, she wrote that the story appeared in nearly every community she visited, though names and details differed. In one version, she wrote, "The blacksmith becomes a flame that cannot be extinguished." In another, his hammer rings beneath the earth each time injustice rises. In every retelling he lives. Whitmore tried to trace the real man behind the myth, searching plantation records and court logs, but found nothing. It is as though the record of his existence has been deliberately torn away, she concluded, and perhaps that is fitting, for what he represents cannot be contained by paper. As decades passed, the legend became a quiet anthem during darker times. During the Jim Crow years, when violence and humiliation returned under new names, black teachers and elders revived Samuel's story for new generations. They told it in whispers to children who asked why the world was still cruel. "Because pharaohs always rise again," they'd say, "but so do the ones who stand." The story traveled through time like an ember passed hand to hand, glowing whenever courage was needed. In church basements, in union meetings, in schools where books were scarce, the man who stood became a lesson, that even in the face of impossible power, one voice saying no could shake an empire. Fairhaven itself became a ruin swallowed by marsh and memory. By the 1930s, its location had almost vanished beneath the reeds. Local fishermen avoided that stretch of the river, saying lights sometimes flickered there at night, and the sound of iron striking iron echoed faintly through the mist. A reporter from Charleston once visited, hoping to write a ghost story. He found only silence, and the feeling, as he later wrote, that the ground itself was watching. The article was never published, but his notes ended with a single line: "The place is not haunted by a ghost. It is haunted by defiance." In time, the world moved on. The Great Depression came and went, wars were fought, and generations rose and fell. Yet somehow, in quiet corners, the story endured. Old mothers whispered it to their grandchildren before bed. Church choirs sang a hymn called "The Man Who Stood by the Fire," its origins unknown. Historians argued whether the story was fact or folklore, but for the descendants of those who had lived and died in bondage, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that Samuel had once existed, in flesh or in faith, as proof that even in the darkest night of history, one human being had looked tyranny in the eye and refused to kneel. And so, long after the rice fields had turned to swamp and the Hewitt name had faded from memory, the legend of Fairhaven remained, whispered with reverence and fear. The man who stood had become timeless, a story without an ending, a warning to oppressors and a promise to the oppressed. Somewhere in the deep, humid silence of the South Carolina lowlands, people said that when storms passed over the old plantation grounds, thunder didn't sound like thunder at all. It sounded like hammer strikes, low, steady, unyielding, as if Samuel were still working in his forge, shaping not metal, but memory itself. By the mid-20th century, Samuel's story had crossed from whispers into legend, carried now by time itself. The old people who had once heard it firsthand were gone, but their children and grandchildren kept it alive. It was told on porches in summer heat, in classrooms when lessons turned to courage, and in churches where faith and freedom were spoken in the same breath. In 1965, during the height of the civil rights movement, a young activist from South Carolina named Elijah Green stood before a crowd in Montgomery and told them about a man whose name history had tried to erase. He spoke of the man who stood, the blacksmith who faced his master and refused to kneel. The story spread through the movement like fire. Marchers painted the words he stood on signs, beside quotes from King and Malcolm, and elders who had once whispered the tale in secret now shouted it in the open. Samuel's defiance, born in a forge of slavery, found new life in the streets where people demanded freedom once more. When Elijah Green was arrested after a march, he was asked by a guard why he kept risking his life. "Because someone did it before me," he said, "someone who had less and stood taller." Across the South, his answer was repeated like a prayer. Newspapers wrote about the myth of the standing man, though most dismissed it as folklore. But for the people who believed, the myth wasn't a story. It was a mirror. Every time they stood against injustice, every time they refused to bow to violence, they saw Samuel in themselves. His hammer still rang, not from a forge, but in their hearts. Decades later, when the civil rights struggle gave way to quieter battles of equality and memory, Fair Haven's ruins were rediscovered by accident. In 1989, a historian mapping rice plantations along the Waccamaw came upon the overgrown foundations of an estate no one had seen in nearly a century. Buried beneath the vines and moss lay the remnants of a forge, blackened stones, a few rusted tools, and, most striking of all, a piece of iron shaped like a key. No records identified whose land it had been, only fragments of ledgers with the initials M.H. The historian wrote an article for a small regional journal, noting the local legends that had clung to the site. He mentioned the name that kept appearing in whispers from old families, the man who stood. When he published his findings, the story once again stirred from its long silence. Soon, descendants of freed families began to visit the site, leaving offerings, flowers, tools, pieces of iron, even handwritten notes. They came not out of superstition but out of recognition. This was sacred ground, not because of ghosts, but because of memory. In 1995, a group of community leaders raised funds to preserve the area, and a simple wooden marker was placed there. It bore no dates, no titles, no grand inscription, only 5 words: "Here stood the man who stood." Visitors said the simplicity of it made it powerful. It was not a monument to a myth, but a tribute to a truth, that a single act of courage could echo through centuries. As years turned into decades, the legend continued to evolve. Writers began to include Samuel's story in collections of Southern folklore. Teachers spoke of him during Black History Month, some calling him an unsung hero of resistance. Yet among the descendants who still lived near Georgetown, the story was never treated as fiction. They would tell their children, "He was real because we are. We're the proof he stood." The land around Fair Haven, once avoided for fear of curses, became a place of quiet reflection. Each February, on the anniversary believed to mark his final night, people gathered by the river with lanterns. They lit small fires and stood in silence, facing the ruins of the old forge. No speeches, no music, only the sound of the wind and the steady hum of the water. They called it the Night of Standing. One winter evening, nearly 2 centuries after Samuel's death, a young boy from Georgetown visited the site with his grandmother. She told him the story as her own grandmother had told it to her, about the blacksmith who loved his family, who refused to kneel, who faced fire and death without surrender. The boy listened wide-eyed, then asked softly, "Did he really live, Grandma?" She smiled and touched his shoulder. "He lives every time someone stands when they could bow, every time someone tells the truth when silence is easier, every time someone chooses dignity over fear." that's how he lives. The boy looked toward the ruins and thought he saw, just for a heartbeat, a faint red glow deep in the shadows, as if a forge still burned somewhere beneath the earth. The years that followed blurred the line between myth and memory completely. Historians continued to debate, but the people who gathered at Fair Haven stopped caring about proof. They understood something deeper, that some truths don't need documentation. They live in the human heart. What began as one man's rebellion in the darkness had become a light that refused to go out. The fields where he had suffered now lay quiet under the stars, but when the wind blew through the cypress trees, it carried a rhythm faint but unmistakable, like the sound of metal meeting metal, patient and unyielding. And so the story ends where it began, in the hum of fire and the courage of a man who chose to stand. The forge may be gone, the plantation vanished, and the names lost to time, but the spirit that rose from Fair Haven endures. In every act of defiance, in every whispered no against injustice, Samuel's heartbeat lives on. The legend of the man who stood is not a ghost story. It is a reminder that even in the deepest dark, one person's courage can forge a freedom that time itself cannot break.